In the late hours of the night, when the moon hung heavy over the dilapidated estate, a storm raged through the countryside, unsettling the quietude that had cloaked the mansion for generations. The wind howled, and the rain lashed against the windows with such ferocity that it almost seemed like nature itself was rebelling. Inside, the fire in the hearth flickered weakly, casting long, dancing shadows across the crumbling walls. In the dimly lit drawing room, an old portrait hung on the wall, a family portrait, its subjects long gone but immortalized forever in oil. There was an eerie stillness about it, the kind of stillness that had long since been shattered by tragedy and whispered legends. The family that once called this mansion home had a reputation, one that stretched back centuries. They were known by their surname, a name that was synonymous with power and prominence in the region. But beneath the layers of wealth, status, and respectability lay something darker. Something that few knew of, and even fewer dared to speak about. The bloodline, for all its riches, was marked by a history that refused to be forgotten. A history that threatened to tear apart everything they had built. It was said that a curse hung over the family, one so ancient and powerful that it was woven into the very fabric of their existence. The origins of this curse, however, were as mysterious as the family itself. No one in the modern era knew for certain when it had begun or why. Some claimed it was a punishment for sins committed long ago, others whispered about a ritual, a forgotten ritual lost to time, that had been performed by an ancestor whose name had been erased from the family records. The details of this ritual were known to very few, and those who spoke of it often did so in hushed tones, fearful of invoking its power. It had been many years since the last member of the family had lived in the mansion, but the house remained, as did its legacy. Some believed that the curse had long since faded, that the passing of time had rendered it nothing more than a myth. But for those who dared to research the family's past, for those who unearthed the hidden journals and letters that spoke of the bloodline's earliest days, the truth was much more chilling. There were stories, fragmented and unreliable, of strange occurrences that plagued the family through the centuries. Members of the household, each in turn, had been struck by inexplicable misfortunes. A sudden illness that left them bedridden for months, a violent accident that took a life far too soon, or inexplicable disappearances that were never fully explained. But the most disturbing of these stories, the one that seemed to echo through the generations, was the tale of the ritual, a blood sacrifice perhaps, or a vow made under duress, that had bound the family to an ancient pact with forces beyond their understanding. To understand the curse, one had to look back far, into the heart of the family's origins, to the period when the bloodline had been at its peak. The patriarch of the family, a man of considerable influence, had been known for his ambition. He had moved mountains to ensure his family's legacy would endure through the ages. Yet it was his desire to secure that legacy, by any means necessary, that led to the darkest chapter in their history. It is believed that the patriarch, in his quest for power, sought out the knowledge of an old and forgotten cult, an underground group of mystics and ritualists whose practices were shrouded in secrecy. These individuals, some said, had the ability to commune with ancient forces, to strike bargains with those who existed beyond the veil of the natural world. They could grant power, wealth, and immortality, but at a terrible price. The patriarch, in his desperation, turned to them, hoping to cement his family's place in history. The ritual was conducted under the cover of darkness, in a forgotten corner of the estate, a hidden chamber that had been sealed off for generations. The exact details of what transpired in that chamber remain a matter of speculation, but the consequences were undeniable. The patriarch, for reasons lost to history, made a pact that would bind his family to the forces of the supernatural. And in return, the family would be cursed, bound to an unholy fate for as long as their bloodline endured. What followed was a steady descent into tragedy. The once great family, its members revered by all, began to crumble. Their fortune faltered, their reputation sullied. One by one, the members of the family met untimely deaths, each more tragic than the last. The deaths were never fully explained, but those who had lived alongside them began to notice a strange pattern. Every death seemed to carry with it a sense of inevitability, as though the family were helpless in the face of some unseen hand that had already written their fates. Generations passed, and the mansion grew more desolate. The family's name faded from the annals of history, but the curse, whatever it was, lingered. It was a curse not just of death, but of fate itself. For those born into the bloodline, life seemed a never-ending cycle of loss and tragedy. No matter what they did, no matter how hard they tried, the curse would always find them. It was as though the very blood that flowed through their veins carried with it the weight of their ancestors' actions, the dark deal made so long ago. But for all the tragedy, the family was not entirely without hope. Some tried to break the curse, to sever the ties that bound them to it. In secret, they sought the knowledge of those who might understand the ancient ritual. They scoured forgotten libraries, consulting old texts that spoke of rituals long lost to time. But the more they uncovered, the more the curse seemed to tighten its grip. It was as if the ritual itself had a will of its own, one that was impossible to escape. For years the truth remained buried. The mansion stood empty, its windows dark, the rooms silent. But there were those who still remembered. Those who believed that the family's story, with all its tragedy and mystery, had to be told. They knew that the answers, if they could be found, lay within the mansion's walls. But as they ventured closer to the truth, they too began to feel the presence of something ancient, something that watched from the shadows. Was the curse real? Or was it merely the result of years of superstition and grief? No one could say for certain. But what was clear was that the legacy of the family, the curse that had followed them for generations, was far from over. It waited, silent, patient, waiting for the next chapter to unfold. The storm outside raged on, and the mansion, for all its emptiness, seemed alive with something unspoken. Something dark. Something that had been waiting for this moment. The story of the curse that haunted the family was one whispered in the darkest corners of history. It was not the kind of tale that appeared in textbooks, nor was it one that the elders were eager to recount. The details, scattered and fragmented, only seemed to deepen the mystery. The more one tried to piece together the fragments, the more elusive the truth became. But as the story began to emerge, it was clear that there was one thread that tied everything together. A ritual long forgotten by most, but with consequences that had stretched across centuries. This ritual, which no historian dared speak of, had its origins in an age when the world was less civilized, more superstitious, and far more willing to make dangerous bargains with unseen forces. It was an age when the line between the mortal and the supernatural was thin, and people believed in powers beyond their comprehension. The patriarch of the family, driven by ambition, had sought out such powers that promised wealth, influence, and immortality. But at what cost? To understand the ritual, one had to first understand the desperation that had led to it. The patriarch had built his wealth through sheer force of will. He had clawed his way to the top, his ambition burning like an uncontrollable fire. But the one thing he could not conquer, the one thing that eluded him, was time. No matter how powerful he became, no matter how many adversaries he defeated, time was a force that even he could not control. And as his years began to mount and his body began to show signs of age, he became consumed by a fear that he had never known before, the fear of death. The fear of death is a powerful motivator, one that has driven many to make decisions they would otherwise never consider. For the patriarch, it was this fear that led him to seek out the cult. The cult was known only in the darkest rumors, whispers of men and women who had turned to ancient practices, forgotten by the rest of the world. It was said that they could commune with forces beyond the mortal realm, that they could bargain with entities whose very existence defied comprehension. They could offer power, wealth, and, most tempting of all, immortality. But the cost was always steep. At first, the patriarch had been skeptical. He was a man of reason, a man who had built his empire on logic and calculation. But as his fear of death grew, so did his desperation. He had to secure his legacy, to ensure that his name would live on long after he was gone. And so, he found himself standing before the cult, ready to make a deal that would change everything. The cult's members were an enigma. Their faces were often concealed, their words cryptic and veiled in riddles. They spoke of ancient rituals, of blood oaths, of forces that existed long before humanity had ever walked the earth. The patriarch, though wary, was convinced that he had found the answer to his problem. In his mind, the deal was simple: power, wealth, and immortality in exchange for a small price. He had no idea how wrong he was. The ritual itself was unlike anything the patriarch had ever imagined. It was performed in secret, deep within the mansion's hidden chambers, places that were known only to a few of the family's closest servants. It was said that the cult had come prepared, bringing with them strange instruments, herbs, and relics that hummed with an energy that was both alien and terrifying. The air itself seemed to tremble with anticipation as the cultists began their chants, invoking names that had not been spoken in millennia. For the patriarch, it was as though time itself had stopped. The ritual was long drawn out and grueling, but he did not flinch. He was willing to endure any pain, to sacrifice anything, if it meant securing his place in history. He offered his blood, his very life force, as the final piece of the bargain. The bloodline would be bound to the ritual, and the family's legacy would be secured. But what the patriarch did not understand, what no one in the room fully grasped, was that immortality was not a gift, it was a curse. The ritual had been designed to bind the family to an ancient and powerful force, one that existed outside the realm of human understanding. The cultists, whose motives remained unclear, were only the messengers. The true power behind the ritual was something far older, far more sinister. It was said that this force, ancient and vengeful, had once ruled over the land, long before mankind had risen to power. It was a force that demanded tribute, and in return, it granted the family wealth, influence, and, at least in the patriarch's mind, immortality. But immortality, as the patriarch would come to understand, was not the gift it seemed. Instead of eternal life, the patriarch had bound his family to a fate worse than death. The force, ancient and merciless, would watch over the family with unblinking eyes, ensuring that every member would suffer. The patriarch's descendants would be cursed to live in a state of perpetual decay, never fully alive, never fully dead. Their lives would be marked by tragedy, their every step haunted by the unseen presence of the force they had summoned. In the days following the ritual, the patriarch began to realize the magnitude of his mistake. The first sign that something had gone terribly wrong came when his own health, despite all efforts to preserve it, began to deteriorate rapidly. His once strong body began to wither, and the gleam of youth left his eyes. He could feel it, an unnatural force coursing through his veins, leeching away his vitality. Desperation took hold. He tried to undo what had been done, but it was too late. The pact had been sealed. In the years that followed, the family's fortunes began to dwindle. The patriarch's once prosperous empire faltered, and his heirs too were struck by misfortune. Each generation seemed to suffer a fate worse than the last. Accidents, illnesses, disappearances, these were the hallmarks of the family's decline. But it was not until the deaths began that the true horror of the curse became apparent. The deaths were not natural. They were violent, sudden, and inexplicable. Family members, once strong and healthy, fell ill with mysterious afflictions that no doctor could diagnose. Some disappeared without a trace, their bodies never found. Others were found in strange circumstances, their deaths marked by signs of unnatural forces at work. The house itself seemed to change. Rooms that were once familiar became labyrinthine, their walls shifting and closing in. And the portraits, those same portraits that had once hung proudly on the walls, began to change. The faces in the paintings, once full of life, now seemed to watch with empty, soulless eyes. The family's desperate attempts to break the curse only deepened their misery. They searched for answers in ancient texts, consulted mystics, and even attempted to destroy the artifacts that had been used in the ritual. But no matter what they did, the curse remained, its grip tightening with each passing generation. The bloodline, once proud and powerful, was now a shadow of its former self, marked by death, tragedy, and a legacy that could never be erased. And so, the mystery deepened. The ritual, long forgotten by most, was the key to understanding the curse. But even as those who sought to uncover the truth began to understand the nature of the family's plight, they could not escape the feeling that the curse was still alive, still watching. The forces that had been summoned on that fateful night were not finished with the family, not by a long shot. And as the mansion stood, silent and empty, it waited for the next chapter in its dark history to unfold. The curse that had plagued the family for generations had remained an unsolved mystery, its dark tendrils creeping into every corner of their lives. For years, the family had lived in denial, brushing aside the strange occurrences as mere coincidence. But as the years wore on, the tragedies piled up, and it became impossible to ignore the undeniable connection between the ritual and the disasters that followed. What had begun as whispers of misfortune had evolved into a full-blown nightmare. And it was in the quiet town, far from the mansion, that a young historian would unknowingly begin the unraveling of the dark truth. It all started with an innocuous inquiry, a simple research project for a university thesis. This historian, a young and ambitious scholar named Evelyn, had come across references to the family's name in her studies of the region's history. She was intrigued by the family's legacy, once prominent, now faded into obscurity. But what piqued her interest was not the family's rise to power, but rather their mysterious downfall. There were gaps in the historical record, unusual omissions, and odd references that hinted at something more, something darker. As Evelyn delved deeper into the family's past, she encountered roadblocks. Archives were mysteriously incomplete, and sources that should have been readily available were conspicuously absent. Local historians had little to say on the matter, offering only vague stories or disjointed accounts. Some refused to even discuss the family, as if the very mention of their name invoked a sense of unease. But Evelyn was determined. She was driven by an instinct that she couldn't explain, a need to understand what had truly happened to this once great bloodline. Her breakthrough came when she stumbled upon a letter, an old, yellowed piece of parchment hidden within the personal papers of a long-dead ancestor. The letter was addressed to the patriarch of the family, the same man who had made the ill-fated pact with the cult. The letter contained a single sentence, one that would change everything. The ritual has bound us, and it is now too late. It was enough to send Evelyn down a rabbit hole of research she had never anticipated. What ritual? What had happened to the family after the pact was made? The letter spoke of a binding, but no one had ever explained the nature of this pact, nor had anyone dared to delve into it. Every source Evelyn consulted seemed to shy away from providing answers, as though some unseen force was pushing her away. Yet she could feel the pull of the mystery growing stronger. She was on the brink of discovering something monumental, something no one had dared uncover for generations. Determined to uncover the truth, Evelyn began tracking down the last remaining members of the family. She located a distant cousin, a woman named Clara, who had lived in the mansion as a child. Clara had inherited the family's wealth and the estate but had long since abandoned the mansion, having left the area after a traumatic event in her youth. Clara was reluctant to speak, but Evelyn's persistence eventually wore her down. When they met, Clara's eyes were cold as though they had seen too much. She was a woman marked by sorrow, and her voice trembled as she spoke of her family's history. At first, Clara insisted that there was nothing to discuss, that the mansion and the family's history should remain buried. But Evelyn's questions gnawed at her, bringing forth memories that Clara had tried for years to suppress. She spoke of the strange occurrences she had witnessed as a child. Whispers in the walls, faces appearing in the windows when no one was there, objects moving on their own. But it wasn't until she mentioned the night her parents died that the real horror began to surface. Clara recalled how, in the years before her parents' tragic deaths, she had heard strange chanting emanating from the depths of the mansion. At first, she had dismissed it as the wind, but as time went on, the sound grew louder and more distinct, as if it were coming from the walls themselves. Her parents, who had always been strong and protective, became distant and withdrawn, often locking themselves in their study for hours on end. Clara, unable to make sense of it, began to search for answers. What she discovered, hidden deep in the attic, was a series of journals, written by her grandmother, the wife of the patriarch. In them, Clara found the first clear description of the ritual. Her grandmother had written about the night it took place, describing in vivid detail the cult's arrival and the chanting that filled the air. She wrote of her husband's growing obsession with the ritual and his eventual decision to go through with it. But it was the final entry that truly chilled Clara to the bone. Her grandmother had written that after the ritual was complete, she saw something in her husband's eyes, a darkness that wasn't there before. It was as though the man she had married was no longer the same. And in the following days, strange events began to occur. People began to die. Family members, friends, even servants, all fell victim to mysterious, violent deaths. Clara's heart pounded as she recounted the events of her childhood. She had been a young girl when her parents had died, and her memories were clouded by fear. She had witnessed the aftermath of the curse firsthand, the unexplained deaths, the growing sense of dread that seemed to permeate every inch of the mansion. But the worst part was the way her family members had changed. It wasn't just their fates that were sealed, it was their very souls. Clara described how her relatives, once strong and vibrant, had withered away, their bodies deteriorating at an unnatural rate, their minds slowly slipping into madness. In the midst of all this, Clara had been the only one who had managed to escape. But even now, as she sat across from Evelyn, the memories still haunted her. The mansion, the place she had once called home, was not just a house, it was a prison. A prison that had bound her family to the curse for eternity. Evelyn, now fully immersed in the mystery, knew that she had to go to the mansion. She had to see for herself what remained of the family's legacy. Clara, though reluctant, agreed to accompany her. The two women set out for the mansion, the weight of history pressing down on them with every mile they traveled. As they approached the estate, the air seemed to grow heavier, the sky darker. The mansion loomed before them like a sentinel, its windows staring out like hollow eyes. It was as though the house itself was waiting for something or someone. Clara hesitated, her hand gripping the door handle tightly as she looked up at the imposing structure. She had not set foot in the mansion for years, but the memories came flooding back as if no time had passed at all. Inside, the mansion was eerily silent. The air was thick with dust, and the once grand halls now seemed to close in on them. The wallpaper was peeling, the furniture covered in sheets, as though the house had been abandoned in a hurry. But as they moved deeper into the house, Evelyn could feel it, the oppressive presence that Clara had described. It was as though something was watching them, something ancient, something hungry. The deeper they went, the more Evelyn began to uncover. Old letters hidden behind bookshelves, strange symbols carved into the walls, remnants of rituals long past. It was clear that this was not just a house, it was a tomb. A tomb that held the secrets of the family's downfall, a tomb that had been sealed for years, waiting for the right person to uncover its horrors. And as Evelyn explored the mansion, piece by piece, the truth began to reveal itself. The ritual had indeed been performed. And its consequences had not only cursed the family but had marked them forever. The curse was not just a series of deaths, it was a bond to something far more sinister. Something that had been unleashed that fateful night, and had never fully been contained. The mansion, once a symbol of power and wealth, was now a monument to despair. And as Evelyn and Clara stood in its depths, they could not help but feel the weight of the Bloodline's legacy pressing down on them. The ritual had been performed, and its price had been paid. But the curse, whatever it was, had not yet finished its work. The deeper Evelyn and Clara ventured into the mansion, the more they uncovered, yet the weight of the silence and the looming presence within the walls became almost unbearable. Each creaking floorboard beneath their feet, each whisper of wind through cracked windows, seemed to remind them that they were not alone. The house had been empty for years, but it felt alive in a way that suggested it had never truly let go of its former inhabitants, their sins and their curses. Clara's anxiety only deepened as they explored further. She had hoped that the years of separation from the mansion would somehow distance her from the horrors of her childhood, but as each corner of the mansion revealed its secrets, her fears began to resurface. The house had always felt oppressive, as if it had its own soul, an ancient, malevolent soul that had witnessed too much, absorbed too much of the family's history. The memories of her parents, her cousins, the servants, those who had died or disappeared without explanation, were fresh in her mind. As much as she tried to convince herself that the past was behind her, the mansion seemed to pull her back into it, dragging her through a spiral of fear and grief she had long buried. "Are you sure about this, Evelyn?" Clara asked, her voice barely a whisper as they entered the long, dark hallway. The paintings on the walls, once proudly displaying the family's ancestors, now hung crooked and faded. The eyes of the figures in the paintings seemed to follow them, the hollow stares unsettling as though the ancestors were judging them for what they had unearthed. "Maybe it's better to leave. Some things, they should stay buried." Evelyn, however, was resolute. The pieces were coming together, and she could feel the pulse of the mystery thumping in her chest. "We're so close," she replied, her voice steady despite the creeping sense of dread that had taken hold of her. "I need to understand this. I need to know what really happened to your family, what the ritual did to them." But even as she spoke, Evelyn couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, that the house itself was aware of their presence, aware of their intentions. There was something undeniably wrong about the place, something that went beyond the decaying structure and the remnants of a bygone era. The deeper they went, the more the atmosphere seemed to shift. The air grew thicker, the shadows longer. And in some rooms, Evelyn swore she saw flickers of movement in the corners of her eyes. At first, she chalked it up to the dim lighting, but the longer she stayed, the more the feeling of being followed intensified. She admitted that she had tried to speak out at one point, but she had been silenced. Threats had been made, and she had been warned to keep quiet if she valued her job or her safety. In the end, she had complied, but the weight of the truth continued to gnaw at her. Her testimony was just one piece of the puzzle, but it was a crucial one. It provided the first tangible clue that something truly sinister had been taking place in that wing. But it also raised the stakes. If the nurse's account was to be believed, it meant that the hospital had been involved in something far more disturbing than anyone had anticipated. This was no ordinary medical malpractice or administrative failure. The sealed wing wasn't just a forgotten part of the hospital. It was a place where people had been subjected to experiments, where patients had been treated like nothing more than test subjects. It was a place where lives had been destroyed. As the investigation continued, more former staff members came forward, each with their own disturbing accounts. One doctor, who had worked in the wing for years, revealed that there had been discussions about conducting advanced treatments, which were never properly documented or approved. These treatments were not part of any clinical trials, and there were no official records of them being performed. The doctor admitted that he had been part of these treatments, though he had always questioned their legitimacy. But like the others, he had kept quiet, fearing the consequences of speaking out. It wasn't until the wing was sealed off that he realized the extent of what had been happening. Meanwhile, patients who had been treated in the sealed wing began to speak out as well. Some were hesitant at first, still haunted by their experiences, but eventually they too came forward. Their accounts were eerily similar: strange procedures, unexplainable symptoms, and in some cases outright negligence on the part of the medical staff. Some of them had been part of experimental trials, though they had never been told what the trials were for. Others had been given treatments that seemed to make their conditions worse, not better. The more these patients shared, the clearer it became. The sealed wing had been a place where the boundaries of medical ethics had been pushed, perhaps even broken. But amid all the revelations, there was still one question that lingered above the rest. Why had it all been kept so secret? Why had the wing been sealed without warning or explanation? And who was pulling the strings behind the scenes, ensuring that the truth never saw the light of day? As the investigation drew closer to the heart of the mystery, it became evident that the answers would not be easy to uncover. Someone, perhaps more than one person, had gone to great lengths to hide the truth. And the closer the investigators got to revealing what had happened in the sealed wing, the more dangerous the pursuit became. The deeper the investigation went, the more layers of deception and manipulation were uncovered. There were forces at play that were far more powerful than anyone had anticipated, and they were willing to do whatever it took to keep the truth buried. The sealed wing was just the beginning of a much larger, more complex web of corruption and secrecy. But who was behind it all? And what were they willing to do to protect their darkest secrets? With each passing day, the mystery deepened and the stakes grew higher. The investigation had only just begun, but one thing was clear: the truth was far more terrifying than anyone had ever imagined. The day the sealed wing was locked for the last time, a sense of finality descended over the hospital. But it wasn't the kind of finality that brought closure or peace. Instead, it was a heavy, oppressive silence that followed. The doors were locked, the windows sealed, and the once bustling hallways stood eerily still. Outside, life in the city continued as normal, but inside the hospital, everything had shifted. The hospital administration, despite their best efforts, could no longer avoid the mounting pressure. The questions were piling up, and there were whispers everywhere, among the staff, the patients, and the families of those who had passed through the doors of that forgotten wing. What had happened there? Why had it been sealed off so suddenly with no explanation? And perhaps most disturbingly, what was being hidden? The sealed wing had always been a part of the hospital's history, but it had never been fully understood by the public. The average person had no reason to question what went on behind its doors. The hospital had an air of professionalism and trustworthiness, and the wing, though isolated and mysterious, was simply another part of the hospital. It had a purpose, or so everyone thought. But now, with the wing sealed off, with the hospital refusing to answer any questions, everything had changed. They had come this far. There was no turning back. The heavy silence in the mansion grew more oppressive with every step Evelyn and Clara took. The mansion, once grand and full of life, now seemed to pulse with an energy that was not of this world. The air was thick with the scent of old wood, mildew, and something far more unsettling, something like the remnants of a long-lost presence that refused to leave. It was as if the house itself were a living thing, holding its breath in anticipation of the moment when the truth would finally be uncovered. Evelyn's pulse quickened, her steps faltering for just a moment as she felt the weight of something unseen pressing against her chest. Clara, for all her reluctance, seemed to have a renewed sense of urgency in her movements now. There was no hesitation, no looking back. She was driven by something more powerful than fear now, perhaps a desperate need for closure, or perhaps a hope that the revelation of the truth would finally free her from the memories that had haunted her for so long. But even she could feel it now, the presence in the house. The feeling that they were no longer alone. Whatever force had cursed her family, it was still here, still watching them, waiting for them to uncover what had been sealed away. The hallway stretched out before them, and with each step, the shadows seemed to grow deeper, more foreboding. The walls, once adorned with portraits of family members, now seemed to leer down at them. The faces in the paintings, once vibrant with life, had become gaunt and hollow, their eyes almost accusing. Evelyn's fingers brushed against the cold, cracked wallpaper as they passed, and the moment her hand made contact, she felt a sudden jolt, an electric charge that shot up her arm. She recoiled instinctively, her breath catching in her throat. There was something wrong with this place, something ancient and powerful that had latched onto them the moment they stepped inside. Clara didn't seem to notice Evelyn's reaction, her mind too occupied with the path ahead. She had led Evelyn up the stairs and into this hallway for a reason. This was where the most important clues lay, At least, that's what her grandmother's journals had suggested. They were close. Clara could feel it in her bones, the pull of the past drawing them into a room they had both avoided for so long. A room where the final horrifying truths would be revealed. They reached the door at the end of the hallway. It was ancient, the wood warped and split with age, its surface covered in dust and cobwebs. Clara's hand trembled as she reached for the doorknob, but she hesitated for just a moment before turning it. The door creaked open with a sound that seemed to reverberate through the house, disturbing the silence that had settled like a heavy blanket. Behind the door, a dimly lit room awaited them, its furnishings covered in sheets that had long since turned yellow with age. A cold draft swept across their faces as they stepped inside, and the temperature seemed to drop several degrees. Evelyn stepped forward, her heart pounding in her chest. The room was small, but it had an unsettling, almost claustrophobic quality to it. At the far end, beneath a small, grimy window, stood an old desk. Its surface was cluttered with papers, ink bottles, and an assortment of objects Evelyn couldn't immediately identify. But what caught her eye was something far darker, a small ornate box sitting in the center of the desk. It was unlike anything she had seen before, crafted from dark wood, its surface adorned with intricate carvings that seemed to shift as she looked at them. The carvings depicted strange, twisted figures, some humanoid, others more grotesque, their forms melting into one another in ways that defied logic. Clara moved to the desk with a sense of purpose, her hands shaking as she reached for the box. "This is it," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "This is where it all began." Evelyn watched as Clara carefully opened the box. Inside, resting on a bed of black velvet, was a small, faded parchment, old and fragile, its edges curling with age. Clara's hands trembled as she picked it up, unfolding it slowly as though afraid it would disintegrate in her hands. Evelyn leaned in, her breath caught in her throat as Clara began to read the words written on the page. The text was in an old script, the ink faded and smeared in places, but Evelyn could make out enough to understand its meaning. The ritual, the curse, it was all here written in cold, meticulous detail. The paper spoke of an ancient pact, one that had been sealed with blood and shadow, binding the family to the forces that lurked beyond the veil. The ritual was a promise, a bargain made between the patriarch and the cult, a promise that would exact a terrible price. But the most chilling part of the parchment was the final sentence, a warning written in the same hurried, panicked hand that had appeared in Clara's grandmother's journals. "The curse is not over. It waits, patient watching. And when the time comes, it will claim what is owed." Evelyn's blood ran cold as the weight of the words sank in. The curse was not just a string of tragedies or an ancient superstition. It was a living, breathing force, one that had never truly been banished, merely held at bay. It was waiting, biding its time, and as the last of the family's bloodline, Clara was marked. Evelyn could feel the weight of this revelation settle over her like a thick fog. It wasn't just the family's legacy that was doomed, it was Clara's fate as well. Clara, as though sensing Evelyn's growing dread, turned the page over, revealing more. The ink was faded, but the words were clear. The cult had not just performed a ritual, they had bound the family to the curse through the bloodline. The pact had been made, but there was no way to reverse it. The family's future would be defined by tragedy, by loss, and by death. Each generation would suffer, their lives twisted by forces beyond their comprehension. And in the end, the last member of the bloodline would be taken, consumed by the very force they had sought to control. Clara's face drained of color as she finished reading, her hands shaking as she closed the box. She couldn't bring herself to say anything, but the look in her eyes told Evelyn everything she needed to know. Clara had known this day would come, the day when the truth would be revealed. But now that it was before her, she didn't know what to do with it. Could she escape it? Could anyone? The house seemed to grow darker, the walls closing in as if the very structure itself was reacting to the knowledge they had uncovered. The shadows stretched unnaturally across the floor, twisting like living things reaching toward them. The temperature dropped again and a low, guttural sound filled the room, almost like a growl, faint but unmistakable. Evelyn's heart raced in her chest, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She turned to Clara, her voice tight with fear. "We need to leave," she said, but Clara didn't move. She stood frozen, her eyes wide, her body tense, as though rooted to the spot by something far more powerful than fear. But then, just as suddenly as the sound had started, it stopped. The room fell silent again. Clara blinked as though snapping out of a trance. "It's not over," she whispered, the words barely audible. "It's not over. We've unleashed something worse than the curse." Evelyn looked at Clara, horrified. "What do you mean? What have we done?" Clara's eyes filled with tears as she finally turned to face Evelyn. The curse didn't just claim my family's souls. It's been waiting, biding its time. And now, it's after us. The room around them seemed to grow colder still, as if the very air had thickened with the weight of some unseen presence. Clara stumbled backward, knocking over a chair as she fell to her knees, gasping for breath. Evelyn's mind raced. She could feel it now, something in the air, something ancient and dark that had been waiting for this moment. The house, the curse, the force that had once been sealed away, it was here and it was awake. And it was hungry. As the shadows shifted around them, Evelyn realized with chilling clarity that they had crossed a line from which there was no return. The curse was no longer a distant memory or a tale from the past. It had found them. It was now alive in the mansion, its power growing with each passing second. And as Clara's sobs filled the room, Evelyn realized that no matter how hard they tried, there would be no escape. The curse would claim them just as it had claimed every generation before them. The weight of Clara's words hung in the air like a storm cloud, thick with an oppressive energy that felt like it could swallow them whole. "The curse is awake," she had whispered, her voice trembling, and Evelyn felt the chilling truth of it seep into her bones. The walls of the mansion, once silent and still, now seemed to breathe with an ancient, malevolent presence. The very air around them felt charged with an unsettling force, as if something was waiting, watching. Evelyn's heart raced in her chest, her breath coming in shallow, panicked gasps. The realization hit her like a cold wave. They had awoken something that had slumbered for centuries. Clara, still kneeling on the floor, wiped her tears away, her face pale and drawn. "It's never truly gone," she said, her voice barely audible, as if speaking too loudly would make the presence in the house stronger. "The curse never left us. It was just lying in wait, waiting for the right moment, waiting for someone to come and uncover it." Evelyn's mind spun with the implications. The family had thought they could escape it, move on from the tragedy, but Clara's bloodline had been marked by the ritual. Every step they took now seemed to drag them further into the web of the curse, a web that had been spun long before they arrived. And now that they had learned the truth, it was no longer content to remain hidden. It was hungry. The shadows in the room seemed to stretch and writhe, curling like dark tendrils along the walls. The temperature had dropped further, and Evelyn could see her breath in front of her, a misty exhale that lingered in the air before fading into nothingness. The low growl that had reverberated through the room moments before had vanished, but its echoes still lingered, a constant hum in the background of their awareness. It was as if the house itself had become an extension of the curse, a living, breathing entity that fed off the fear of those who dared to uncover its secrets. "What do we do now?" Evelyn's voice trembled as she looked at Clara, her mind racing for a solution, for a way out. She could feel the weight of the mansion's history pressing down on her, the curse's grip tightening around her throat. She had always believed that the truth would set them free, that uncovering the secrets of the past would bring clarity, but now she realized that the truth was the thing that had unleashed the darkness. There was no freedom from it. Clara slowly stood up, her eyes wide with horror as she glanced around the room, her body stiff with fear. "There's nothing we can do. The curse, it's not just a series of bad luck. It's a force. It's alive and it's tied to our bloodline. We were born into it and we will die by it. Just like every generation before us." Evelyn's thoughts churned. The journal, the warnings, the house itself, it all pointed to one thing. The curse had never been a series of isolated events, but rather a continuous cycle. A cycle that had claimed the lives of Clara's ancestors and would continue to do so until there was no one left to claim. But even as the realization sunk in, a part of Evelyn's mind refused to accept it. There had to be something they could do, some way to stop it. They couldn't just give up, not when they were so close to understanding the truth. "We can't just give up," Evelyn said, her voice firmer now. She stepped toward Clara, grabbing her by the shoulders, her eyes filled with determination. "We have to find a way to break it. There has to be something, some part of the ritual that we can undo. If we can find it, we can stop it. We can end this." Clara's eyes met hers, and for the briefest moment, Evelyn saw a flicker of hope, something deep inside her cousin's eyes that had been buried for years. But it was quickly replaced by the same hopelessness that had plagued Clara for so long. "It's too late, Evelyn. The pact was made and there's no way to undo it. The ritual bound us to that force, and the price we've paid is far greater than we could ever imagine. Our blood is marked. And the curse doesn't just kill us. It devours our souls. Every generation it gets stronger, until there's no one left to suffer but the thing that waits at the end." Evelyn felt a cold shiver run down her spine. The curse didn't just kill, it consumed. It was as though the family had never been more than a vessel for something far older and far darker than they could understand. The realization was terrifying, and yet, Evelyn couldn't shake the feeling that there was still a thread of hope. There had to be something. As Clara sank into the nearest chair, her body slumped with exhaustion, Evelyn turned her attention back to the room around them. The walls seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy, the shadows twisting and undulating as if the house itself were alive. The very air was thick with an ancient malevolence that made her skin crawl. It was as though the house had absorbed the suffering of Clara's family over the years and now, it was preparing to claim them as well. Evelyn's eyes drifted to the box on the desk, the one that had held the parchment with the cursed ritual. She walked toward it, her fingers brushing against the cool surface of the wooden box. As she opened it again, she found something she hadn't noticed before. Beneath the fragile parchment was a small, faded key. It was simple, wrought iron, its shape jagged and worn with age. But as Evelyn held it in her hand, she could feel an undeniable connection to it, as though it were calling to her. "What's this?" she whispered, turning the key over in her fingers. "What is this for?" Clara glanced at it, her face unreadable. "I don't know," she replied softly. "But I've seen that key before. It's tied to something hidden in the mansion. My grandmother mentioned it in her journals. It's supposed to unlock something, a door, a room, I don't know. But it's part of the ritual. It's part of the curse." Evelyn's heart skipped a beat. The key, there was something about it that felt important. If it was tied to the curse, tied to the ritual, then it could be the key to breaking the cycle, the only chance they had left. She didn't know what it would unlock, but she knew they had to find out. They had no choice. "We have to find where this goes," Evelyn said, her voice resolute. "We have to find that door, that room, whatever it is. It's the only way." Clara's eyes widened, a mixture of fear and disbelief crossing her face. "Evelyn, you don't understand. That door, it's not just a room. It's where everything began. It's where my family's fate was sealed. You don't know what's waiting on the other side." Evelyn looked at Clara, her face hardening with determination. "I don't care what's on the other side. If this is the only way to stop it, then we have no choice. We have to do it. We have to end this." Clara's expression faltered, a flicker of doubt crossing her face. But then, as if coming to some internal decision, she nodded. "You're right. We can't run anymore. It's time to face this. But I won't pretend I'm not terrified. This house, it's been waiting for us to come back. And once we open that door, there's no going back. The curse will be unleashed again. But this time we'll have to deal with it. Together. Together." Evelyn's mind raced as she thought of the door, of the key, and what lay ahead. There was no turning back. She could feel it. Whatever was hidden behind that door, whatever had been waiting for so long, was the last step in the family's dark legacy. And it was the only thing standing between them and the end of the curse. She could only hope that by unlocking it, they could finally close the door on the darkness that had haunted Clara's bloodline for centuries. With one last glance at Clara, Evelyn gripped the key tightly in her hand. They had no more time to waste. It was time to find the door, and face whatever lay beyond it. Evelyn's grip on the key tightened as she turned away from Clara, the weight of the decision settling heavily on her chest. There was no more time for hesitation, no more room for doubt. The curse was real, there was no denying it now. It wasn't just a string of tragic coincidences. It was a living, breathing force that had followed Clara's family through the generations, and it wasn't finished. It had never been finished. The darkness that had plagued the mansion for so long was waiting for them to come back. And now, Evelyn realized it was preparing to claim them, just as it had claimed the others before. The shadows in the room seemed to deepen as she turned to face Clara. Her cousin's expression was unreadable, a mixture of fear and resignation etched into her features. Clara had been through so much already, and yet the worst was still to come. The truth they had uncovered had brought them to this point, but it had also sealed their fates. There was no escape. Not now. Evelyn's heart hammered in her chest as she moved toward the door, the key clutched tightly in her hand. She could feel the mansion closing in around them as if the very walls were shifting, watching them. It was a feeling of being trapped, as if the house itself were an entity with its own consciousness, aware of their every move. The heavy silence that had once seemed so oppressive now felt almost alive, as though the house was holding its breath, waiting for the next step in its long-forgotten ritual. As they passed through the grand hallway, Clara's pace slowed. She looked at Evelyn, a glimmer of something deep and ancient, flashing in her eyes. "It's too late for me," Clara murmured, her voice barely audible. "I've known that for years. The curse has already claimed me just like it claimed them all. But you, Evelyn, you still have a chance. Don't make the same mistake I did. Evelyn turned to face her cousin, her voice shaking with a mixture of fear and determination. I won't let it end like this. We have to break the cycle, Clara. We have to end this before it destroys everything. Clara shook her head slowly, the weight of the years pressing down on her. It's not that simple. The curse, it's too powerful. You can't fight something like that. The house itself, it's not just a building. It's part of the curse. And that key. Her voice trailed off, the words hanging in the air between them, unspoken but understood. The key is the key to the heart of the curse. And whatever's waiting behind that door, it's not something you're prepared for. Evelyn didn't respond immediately. She couldn't. The fear in Clara's voice was enough to make her doubt everything she had believed. The house, the curse, the ritual, it all seemed so much bigger now, so much more dangerous than she had ever imagined. But there was no turning back. The key was in her hand and the door was waiting. If they didn't open it now, they would be trapped here forever, just like the generations that came before them. Stay close, Evelyn said softly, more to herself than to Clara. The words were meant to steady her nerves, but even as they left her mouth, she couldn't shake the feeling that the house was listening, that whatever was waiting on the other side of that door was aware of their presence, of their fear. The key was heavy in her palm, its jagged edges seeming to pulse with a dark energy that was foreign and ancient. It was as if it was alive, guiding her toward the final confrontation. They reached the end of the hallway and Evelyn's heart stopped. There was the door. It was old, the wood darkened with age, the grain warped and cracked. The doorknob was rusted, but there was no mistaking the strange, almost sinister aura that surrounded it. The air grew colder as they approached, the temperature dropping so suddenly that Evelyn shivered involuntarily. The key in her hand felt like it was burning with an unnatural heat, urging her to act. Clara stood behind her, her breath shallow, her hands trembling. Evelyn turned to look at her cousin one last time, her eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and determination. Clara's expression was resigned now, as though she had already accepted her fate. There was no way to save her, not now. But there was still time to stop the curse, to break the cycle before it claimed yet another generation. That was the only thing that mattered now. Are you ready? Evelyn asked, her voice barely a whisper. Clara nodded, her lips pressed into a thin line. Do it. Open the door. If there's any chance, it's our only hope. Evelyn didn't hesitate. She stepped forward, holding the key up to the lock. As she slid it into place, she felt a sudden jolt of energy, like an electric shock that coursed through her entire body. The door creaked loudly as the lock clicked open, the sound echoing through the mansion like a death knell. Evelyn held her breath, the tension in the air almost suffocating. The moment had come. With a final glance at Clara, Evelyn pushed the door open. The darkness beyond it was absolute. It wasn't just the absence of light, it was as if the very air in the room had been swallowed by the void. A cold, unnatural wind seemed to billow out from the opening, and the shadows inside the room moved, twisting and shifting as though they had a mind of their own. Evelyn stepped forward, her heart racing, every instinct screaming at her to turn and run. But she couldn't. She had come this far. She had to see it through. As the door creaked open fully, Evelyn saw what lay beyond, a narrow, spiraling staircase leading down into the earth itself. It was as if the mansion's foundation had been built atop something much older, something buried deep beneath the ground. The staircase was made of stone, the steps cracked and uneven, each one worn with age. The air was thick with the smell of earth, of decay, and the stench of something far more ancient and sinister. Clara stepped forward, her face pale as she stared at the staircase. This is it, she whispered, her voice filled with awe and fear. The heart of the curse. This is where it all began. Evelyn felt the weight of her words sink into her chest. This was it. The final descent. They had reached the source of everything, the ritual, the curse, the deaths, the madness. And whatever lay at the bottom of that staircase was the key to ending it. But as they began to move down the stairs, Evelyn could feel something shifting, something watching them from the darkness below. The air grew heavier, pressing down on her lungs with each step they took. The descent seemed endless, as though the staircase spiraled down into the very bowels of the earth. The shadows grew deeper, more oppressive, as if they were closing in on them. Evelyn could hear the sound of her own breath, shallow and fast, the only sound in the vast empty space. But as they neared the bottom, a faint light began to glow in the distance, casting an eerie, otherworldly glow on the stone walls. It was then that Evelyn realized something. This wasn't just a room, a place of power. This was a tomb. A place of death, of suffering, where the family's bloodline had been sealed to the curse. And as they approached the source of that light, Evelyn understood, there was no way to undo what had been done. No way to break the cycle. The ritual had already been set in motion, and whatever awaited them at the end of this staircase would determine whether Clara's family would ever be free, or if they would be consumed by the darkness forever. The narrow staircase seemed to stretch forever, each step taking Evelyn and Clara further into the heart of the mansion's secrets, deeper into the very core of the curse. The walls surrounding them were damp and cold, and the light from the flickering lantern Clara carried cast long, distorted shadows across the jagged stone steps. The descent was unsettling, not just because of the darkness that enveloped them, but because it felt as though they were being drawn toward something far older and far more dangerous than either of them had ever imagined. Every step they took felt like they were crossing into a realm where time and space no longer made sense, where reality itself was warped by the malevolent force that had haunted the family for generations. The farther they went down, the more the air thickened as if it were alive, pressing against them. It was no longer just cold, there was a palpable heaviness in the atmosphere, as though the very air had been soaked in sorrow and death. Evelyn could feel her pulse quicken, her every breath coming harder as the shadows seemed to press in on them. Each time she thought she had gotten used to the oppressive darkness, it would intensify, squeezing her chest tighter. There was something down here, something ancient, something waiting for them to reach it. Clara's breathing was labored now, her footsteps growing more hesitant as the air grew heavier. She glanced back at Evelyn, her eyes wide with fear. This place, I can feel it. It's different from the rest of the house. It's not just haunted, Evelyn. This is something worse. Something unnatural. Evelyn didn't respond immediately, too focused on the path ahead, the distant glow that seemed to grow stronger as they descended. She could feel it too. The closer they got, the more the house seemed to hold its breath. The walls, the very ground beneath them, seemed alive as though it were waiting for them to reach the source of the light below. The sense of anticipation, of something inevitable approaching, gnawed at Evelyn's insides. It was as if whatever was hidden in the depths of the mansion had been waiting for this moment, waiting for someone to open the door and take the final step toward the unknown. At last, after what felt like an eternity, they reached the bottom of the stairs. The light ahead of them was faint, casting a dim, sickly glow across the room they had entered. The walls here were different, carved stone, older and more worn than anything they had seen in the mansion above. The air was thick with the smell of mold, decay and something else, something darker, more acrid. A heavy, lingering stench that seemed to crawl under their skin.